Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. I know it's a long day, so everybody feeling good so far? Good. Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick, for putting this on, and Excella. So I have a quick question. All right, who here in your day job works on legacy code in some form or another? Pretty much everyone, right? Okay, now who works on legacy code and likes it? Yeah. Oh, good. We've got about 5 people. So, so I am one of those random people who just loves working on legacy code. I'm going to tell you the story, and I'm going to tell you why. And then maybe at the end of this conversation, you'll find that you like working on legacy code too and didn't even know it. So Corgi Bytes, we are a company that our mission is to make software stable, scalable, and secure by remodeling software joyfully. With a lot of joy, and I think that's the big difference. So this started because my business and partner and we were watching a show, This Old House. Quick story about how we got into business together. We went to high school together, and then we reconnected at our 10-year high school reunion. We were business partners for 2 years. Scott was he's actually right here. Scott was kind of the typical software engineer. I went to school for marketing and business. He asked me to come on board and help him actually make money at software development. And then we got married a few years later, so now we have kids. So it was kind of a fun, business partnerships can go really well. So yeah, and the joke too is that if anybody in here is looking for a good pickup line, I will give you 51% of my startup is a really good one. So we were sitting around and watching This Old House, and we said, you know what, we remodel homes, but why don't we remodel code? And so we started thinking about, what is it about the culture of the rewrite that has just completely taken over? And we thought, there's a lot of reasons why a business would want to remodel, they could generate revenue faster. They could build new features and get rid of some of that technical debt. They could reduce their operations costs, right? So maybe they got licensing fees because they're on some old ERP system, spending a ton of money. We could move up into the cloud and get them on freer services. We could streamline some of their business operations. And they can also help manage risks, right? We've got test suites that we could build, automations, all this stuff. We're like, why don't companies like to do that? And Scott goes, I don't know, but I would freaking love to do that because my dream job is to remodel people's code. And so the marketing person in me was like, that's what you love to do? Okay, there's a supply and demand, perfect fit. And so I think we can make this work. So worst case, my thought was, Scott will be the only random person who likes doing this work and we'll have kind of a lifestyle business. Best case, we'll find other people. And so that's exactly what we did. So we're a team of about 12 now, and we call ourselves Menders. And so what I'm going to walk through today is what makes Menders different, right? Menders are a different breed than kind of the maker culture that is so pervasive in the world today. You've got Make Magazine, Hackerfest, all this stuff. Strip it all together with, baling wire and duct tape, and poof, you've got an app, right? And we're like, well, okay, what happens after you generate revenue and profit, and then you've got 1,000 users and you want to scale to 1 million? Those are the companies that we really like to work with. And so this is why we love working on legacy code, or better, more I should say, we like making legacy code better, right? So we don't necessarily love making legacy code, but we love making it better. So the first is that there's a really big satisfaction when you have a brownfield application and then you turn it green again, right? Having something that is, kind of seen that other people don't see the value in it and then slowly transforming it, and then you see that your client sells for more money than they thought, or they're able to be acquired by a better company than they thought, or they're able to scale their users, or they're able, you see the successes of your clients, and that really, really motivates us. The next is that there are some really interesting and challenging engineering problems when you dive into the legacy space. You sometimes don't know what you're going to get into, but it's like untangling that knot can be a lot of fun. It's a puzzle. You don't know what you're going to get tossed at. A lot of times you're working with sometimes obscure languages or technologies that you have never even heard of, and you just have to learn it. So from a personal standpoint, it's incredibly challenging and interesting. I have to mention job security because there's a lot of legacy code out there and it's not going anywhere. So software runs our society and we have to make it better, right? So people will always be renovating their applications, but they may stop building new ones, right? They may decide to not do new projects, but when it comes down to the bottom line, people will always need menders to make their applications better. Another example is power tools, right? So the really cool part about being a mender is that you get to work with really fast tooling. So a lot of times people think, oh, well, I don't want to work with that because the languages that you work with are really old and ancient, and I don't want to do that. Well, how about writing, tooling for something like COBOL, right? And there are lots of gems out there that do this. And surprisingly, we actually work with mostly modern languages. So Ruby, Python, .NET, C#. We've got some Java clients as well, PHP. So that kind of makes up the bulk of our work. But what you get to do is you get to work on really cool power tools. And so the way that I describe this is if you had a house that was 100 years old, would you remodel it using only the tools that were available when it was built? No, you would go to Lowe's and you would buy like the fastest, most powerful tool that you could, and that's what you would use for your remodeling. And so we do the exact same thing. So we get to work with all of the modern DevOps tools. We're moving our clients towards continuous integration, continuous deployment. So all of that stuff is the new shiny. The languages specifically, we might be a few years behind, but not by much. But if you think of it more in terms of creating your own power tools or using other people's power tools, there can be a lot of satisfaction there. The other thing is you get to work on work that matters. So we don't tend to get stuff that hasn't been proven yet by the market. So I used to work in advertising, and everybody was like, oh, can you build us the next Facebook? Can you build us the next Twitter? And it's like after the fourth iteration of that, you're kind of like, I don't know if this is really providing a lot of value to society. The things that we get to work on cure frickin' cancer, right? So we're working on lots of stuff in the healthcare space, in the finance industry, in operations, in manufacturing. This is the software that runs the world, and it's really, really important to society. So at the end of the day, I go home from work, and I'm like, yeah, I made the world a little bit more stable and better, and it's a good feeling. You can also see visible progress, right? So we use a lot of static analysis tools. So for more modern languages like Ruby and Python, we use Code Climate, and you can steadily see your code base getting better, right? And that can be very, very rewarding, especially if you look back over time. We had one project where just very steadily it improved by 0.2%, regularly, every week. And so 2 years later, it was like you look at the difference and it's a completely different application. It's modern. We were able to help them get a VP of engineering. They now have a team that they're building out, and they started with something that they thought they were going to throw away. So we are able to measure that progress really, really clearly. And the last is that it's kind of like archaeology a little bit. And in fact, the way that I define legacy code, I actually wasn't satisfied with all of the definitions that were out there. And I like to think of it in terms of archaeology, right? So the standard definition that, is in the very small legacy space, but people know it, is Michael Feathers. And, it's code without tests. And that's how he defines it in his seminal work, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And I started to think about this, and the more that I got involved in legacy projects, I was like, well, that's true, and it's also not complete. So if we think about legacy code, it's legacy code that is code without tests, and that's an artifact of communication, right? That's an artifact of your intention. And there are other things that are really, really important too. So I think of legacy code as code without communication artifacts, of which tests are a really important one. So if you were going to go on an archaeological dig, if you found bones, for example, that would tell you a lot about the society that they lived in, that lived there, right? But also you've got foundations of buildings, you've got pottery shards, you've got coins, you've got written text. And there's a whole nother workshop that I give about communication artifacts, but you can think about it as your git commit messages, right? The documentation that you're providing. What are your test suites, your error messages, even your timesheets. all of these work together to provide a story that gives context to somebody else who's coming in and isn't familiar on the project. And the faster that they can get up to speed, that to me is what defines a greenfield versus a brownfield application. So to me, legacy code is code without communication artifacts. So the way that we kind of got around this, so we kept toying around. So Scott and I are sitting there and going, well, okay, what would a legacy code business look like? And Scott was getting ready to give a talk and about the topic. And we were like, well, here's kind of the typical product life cycle, right? So you've got your introduction here, your growth, maturity, and then decline. So if you go to business school, you learn this. Like every single business person that you probably work with has seen this graph at some point in their college career, right? And so Scott said this, it was an Agile conference, and so he goes, we're Agile here, so that graph needs to be a circle. And I said, that makes no sense, because how are we going to have decline feed back into introduction? And said, well, what if we didn't call it decline? Like, do products have to decline? So we look at things like we looked at brands like Coca-Cola, for example, right? It's constantly reinventing itself and adapting to the market. Why can't software do the same thing? So we're like, all right, well, we'll just scratch that and we'll say, but what are we going to call it? And so we decided to call it remodeling. So the way that we describe what we do is we do software remodeling. And so when we started seeing that there was this really interesting little line that kind of naturally developed too. And so at the top, it was like, well, these are the people who really, really like kind of doing the mending stuff or making stuff. And that's the stuff that we don't really like doing. Like, we really want to work down here in the maturity and remodeling stage. But our clients keep coming to us and asking for things like prototypes and MVPs. What if we just said no? And so we started doing that. We said, no, you know what, there are tons of software shops out there who specialize in making and specialize in designing and experimenting and feature building, and that is fantastic, and we can refer you. But if you want to make your app more stable, then you should come to us. So we are menders, and so we like doing things like bug fixes and refactoring and enhancing performance and security and making things more stable. And this was what really set us apart, because there were companies who needed this, but it was really hard for them to attract and retain the right type of developer who liked doing this work, because only about 10% of people are makers. So if I were to take a quick show of hands in this room, how many people think that they're makers? Yeah, okay, the majority. How many people would identify as a mender? Yeah, okay, oh wow, that's actually a lot more. Okay, great. And if you'll notice, it's more people, so it was about, that was actually about probably a 75-25 split, if I were to assess. And that's more than what we typically see. So whenever I always try to get this at a conference, and we usually get about 10% of developers identify as a mender, right? And so what happens is that they end up being kind of the one lone person on a team who is like, hey folks, put me on the rotation for fixing bugs and working with customer service, because I love doing that. And a lot of times, and I see some heads nodding, they're like, no, we can't have you do that because you're actually a really good developer, so we need you to go build features. Right, but if we look back at the, if we look back at the product lifecycle, that's not the thing that's going to actually make the menders happy, right? So makers, this is how you can kind of think of them. So makers are really, really, really motivated by innovation and ideation. They love taking an idea and bringing it to life and seeing if it could work. So for them, it's all about speed to market. Fast, 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 fast. They're very focused on features, right? So building things that are brand new really gets them excited. Rapid prototyping, right? So let me just get this idea out, sketch it. idea to MVPs. They typically build about an 80% solution, right? And if we know Pareto's principle, then we know the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the work actually exists in 20% of the features, right? So they do about 20% of the work, or implement about 80% of the solution, and then they're like ready to move on to the next project. And the other thing that a maker is really motivated by, which you see in the maker culture, is they're really energized by a super big launch, right? So it's like, we need to have this done by September 1st. Go, go, go. Work as hard as you can, get it done fast, and everybody stays up really late and works really hard. And then there's almost a crash. And then they kind of build up, and then it's like, let's go to the next launch. So Menders are very different. Menders like to fix problems, all right? So technical debt, which is basically how inefficiencies in your code base is how I define technical debt, or the stuff that brings you friction within your development team. So making those things more effective is one of the things that brings us immense amount of joy. We like making a product stable, and so the whole environment is just calm. One of our core values, actually, at Corgi Bytes is calm the chaos, right? Because that works really, really well with our group, in that, if you think about Einstein, when he was chewing on like a really, really, really difficult problem, he would go and he would go and play the violin. And so for that, it's like we want to give our Menders the same autonomy, where it's like, it's not about this kind of speed. It's about solving the problem right. And by giving yourself, by not running on that adrenaline and allowing yourself to kind of just calm down, you end up being way more efficient. The idea, too, is big wins through marginal gains. So marginal gains are basically like, there's no one thing that you can point to that gives things efficiency. It's, I'm doing an incremental improvement on 100 different things, and that is what really elevates it. And so it's kind of the non-zero sum, the positive sum of all of these small little things working together that makes a big difference. And like I mentioned, the slow and steady pace. So it's about just coming to work, doing your thing, making things a little bit better, and that is a thing that really motivates people, which to some people can seem boring. So there are probably some of you in the room who are like, oh my gosh, there are other people like me, thank God. And so you're not alone. And what I would say is, welcome, fellow Menders. We are so glad to have you here. And we actually have a community for you. So I host a podcast called Legacy Code Rocks. You can find it on Stitcher and on iTunes. You can also go to legacycode.rocks. And we have a Slack room, we have mastermind groups, we have a whole community where you can completely geek out with other Menders, even if you're the only Mender on your team. And the last thing that I will leave you with is to remember that your work matters. Menders are very needed. And I think we've heard that quite a bit throughout the theme today, right? So we need the people who are going to focus on making things more stable, more scalable, and more secure. So if you're a Mender, be proud. And I have time for about maybe one question. Yes? How many corgis do I have? I have one. So our corgi is named Ein from Cowboy Bebop. So if anybody, she's the data dog. So and I don't have a picture of it, but we have a cute little picture of her, and she's got TextMate, and we're trying to teach her Adam. So thank you all very much.